Welcome to Expiscor, the weblog of Stephen Hall, Director General of the WorldFish Center. In these blogs, Steve gives his personal reflections on current topics and areas of debate in the realm of fish and development. In this podcast of his blog, Steve explores the idea of whether there are plenty of fish in the sea.
Scan the popular literature, and it's easy to find articles with headings such as imminent declines in fish stocks, collapse in world fisheries, or current fisheries unsustainable. Many of these articles are based on research findings and conclusions that support that view. But how true is this picture? Is the scientific community aligned in its pessimism? Or is there a credible body of researchers who draw from the available data more optimistic conclusions about the current state of the oceans and the direction in which it's heading? To answer this question, let's start with the official statistics from the FAO. Providing the most authoritative assessments of the status of world fisheries, the FAO collects information on about 445 fish stocks every couple of years. And using regional experts and data submitted by member countries, these assessments account for about 80% of the estimated global catch. With these data, the proportion of stocks that are deemed overexploited or beyond provides a useful indicator of world fisheries status. And the most recent FAO estimate is that in 2008, about 32% of stocks were either overexploited, depleted, or recovering but still at very low levels. That's hardly a promising picture, but for most people I suspect 32% falls short of the tragic level of depletion one might imagine from popular news stories. But does everyone agree with the FAO estimate? Well, at first sight the answer would seem to be pretty much. Most of the recent published analyses arrive at a figure of around 30%. Dig a little deeper though, and that apparent consistency is complicated by two factors. First, definitions of overexploitation differ. FAO, for example, define a stock as overexploited when stock biomass falls below what fisheries scientists estimate is that needed for what they call maximum sustainable yield, the long-term surplus fish production that we can take as catch. Other studies define overexploited as less than half of the biomass that produces maximum sustainable yield, a more conservative figure. And there's still more uncertainty because other estimates are derived from approaches that can't really be compared with others. A second problem arises because data for some areas are absent or shaky. In many developing countries, and especially Southeast and East Asia, which are significant sea fishing regions, the data to assess stock status have either not been collected or have not yet been adequately analysed and included in global syntheses. So we've got little feel for how these stocks compare with the rest. Anecdotal reports certainly suggest that many are overexploited, but that's a long way from the formal analysis that's really needed. So, plenty of fish in the sea? Well, even with the uncertainties, it seems that a figure of about 1/3 of the world's stocks below levels needed for maintaining sustainable fish catches is about right. And we need to do something about those. And if you add to that the other 50% or so of stocks that are fully exploited, and it's clear that we're operating at or near the limits of what the ocean can provide. And fishing at these levels inevitably means that fish numbers are lower than they used to be. If we want to take fish from the sea at about the maximum sustainable level, a goal that most societies seem to accept, then for most species the biomass of fish we need to leave in the sea to breed and provide the next year's catch is between 30 and 40% of the amount that would be present if there were no fishing at all. On the other hand, it's also important to realise that even when the authorities class a fish population as overfished or even collapsed, it doesn't mean there's a risk of wiping the population out. The Norwegian coastal cod fishery, for example, remains closed because it's deemed collapsed, yet the stock is still estimated to comprise tens of millions of individual fish. But it's all very well talking about our current situation. The much deeper question is, where are we heading, given what we believe is the current status of fisheries, and the imperative to meet the world's growing need and demand for fish. If we keep going as we are, will all the fish be gone by 2048, as was claimed in 2006 in a prominent paper? Or are we getting our act together and improving matters? Now here, there's considerable disagreement. And the fracture line of opinion seems to turn on whether researchers base their conclusions on analyses using reported fish catches, or whether they believe that using such data are misleading and that only data from proper fish stock assessments and surveys will do. Using catch data, researchers conclude that overexploitation is increasing. Using assessment and survey data, it looks like the proportion of overexploited or collapsed stocks has stayed about the same over the last 40 years. Yet, while this issue remains a topic of hot debate, the plain truth is that for all practical purposes, it doesn't matter whether fish stocks are in the aggregate declining or not. The global fishery might not be the terminally ill patient many imagine, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need treatment for a chronic condition. That treatment is going to require governments and international development agencies to increase investments to secure its future. And failure to do so and maintain productive, long-term sustainable fisheries will have profound economic and food security consequences that even the fastest growing aquaculture industry can't compensate for. Unfortunately, there are no magic recipes for making these investments. It's going to require a continuing case-by-case focus on a broad range of fisheries management tools like catch and effort limitation and time and area closures. But it's also going to need renewed investment in reforms of fisheries governance in many places. Reforms founded upon effective stakeholder dialogue about the goals of each fishery, and that devolve responsibility for management and decision-making to levels where incentives for fisheries to meet these broader societal objectives are highest. Solving the problems for many small-scale fisheries is also going to require a focus outside of the fishing sector itself to improve more fundamental welfare capabilities and opportunities that currently confound reform efforts. Perhaps surprisingly, I confess to a cautious optimism for the future. We do have success stories that show maintaining healthy, viable fisheries is possible, and that conditions are improving in some regions. And new stakeholder fora like the upcoming Economists World Ocean Summit in Singapore are talking about solutions. These are all encouraging signs, and we've got to continue to build on them to sustain world fisheries and their contribution to the millions of people who depend on them.
Thank you for listening to the podcast for Expiscor, the weblog of Stephen Hall. If you've got any comments or feedback for Steve on this podcast, go to www.worldfishcenter.org and post them to the blog, or email expiscor@worldfishcenter.org. Also, be sure to find us on iTunes and subscribe to this podcast.